There it is. Okay. We are recording this session, and I'm going to go over some logistics. So Dr. Walzer will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes before and give us an overview of the subject. And we encourage you during that time to actually send in questions that arise in the chat room. And although most of us have become rapidly proficient in Zoom, the chat window will appear if you click chat in your controls at the bottom, and then you can see it show up on the side. And then I'll assemble those, and then once Chris finishes, I'll start with those questions. But then if we run out of them, we can entertain some questions verbally, and just keep yourself muted beforehand. And then when I call on you, then you can ask a question, and we'll go from there. So please allow me to introduce Dr. Chris Walzer, who is the Executive Director of Health at Wildlife Conservation Society. And the Global Health Program has been integral to our conservation programs around the world for so many years. And it is specifically a response to the urgent need to simultaneously address the health of people and animals, recognizing that disease poses challenges to both conservation of planets by biodiversity and efforts to improve the quality of human life on Earth. So Chris is a board-certified wildlife veterinarian. His work over the past 2 decades has specialized in the Gobi region of Mongolia and Central Asia, linking wildlife health with the conservation of wild horses and asses in particular. But beyond this work, he's internationally recognized with diverse expertise on many facets of wildlife, many different critters, and gained from combined years of leadership and research in Europe, Asia, and Africa. He's authored many, many books and other publications, book chapters and lectures widely. And he's been all over the place in the current situation, explaining to media and many stakeholders and politicians the science behind the origins of the crisis, sort of similar to what he's going to be doing with us today. Last week, he testified before the US Congress, and this week he was one of the experts featured in an Earth Day feature in the Globe and Mail by our science reporter, Ivan Semeniak, and I've pasted the link in the chat room at the very top. Dr. Walzer is the recipient of several research and science awards and is leading WCS's engagement in this space. Can you please mute? Sorry, do other people hear that too?
I hear it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I have power to mute. It's great. Okay, so anyway, this great Earth Day feature in the Globe and Mail, and Dr. Walzer is the recipient of several research and science awards, and he's been leading WCS's engagement in this space. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Chris, and thank you so much, Chris, for doing this for us.
Thanks very much, Justina. Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure. Good afternoon from the Bronx. I'm just going to, oops, I'm not going to do anything because it's not working. There we go. I assume everyone who's on this call is obviously sheltering at home and has been following this pandemic in the past few weeks at least, or some of us since several months, and you've probably all read every single book about pandemics out there. So I'm just going to try to summarize it to quite simple things. What do we know? What do we not know? What are the things we can do? What's WCS doing? And try to put that into a context and try to provide some context to Canada and the temperate regions of the world. So what do we know? We know that zoonoses are diseases that move between animals and humans. They don't only spill over from animals to humans, they go both ways. So depending on the species, sometimes humans are actually the big problem, as we see in our primates, for example. Most of the emerging infectious diseases, so those are the new infectious diseases, are zoonoses, and of those, about 72% of them have a reservoir in wildlife. So the role of wildlife in emerging infectious diseases is really, really important. And the frequency of these emerging diseases is increasing. In the past 50 years, we've seen a marked increase in these infectious diseases. Some of them you've all heard these, but HIV, of course, Ebola, the various influenza virus outbreaks, SARS, Nipah virus, Hendra virus, and so on. So there are a lot of them out there. Some of them have severe impacts, but none of them have had HIV, of course, from its reach and impact and the morbidity and mortality it causes, by far one of the most important zoonotic diseases. But this COVID-19 is obviously also causing significant distress, mortalities, and obviously impacts. One of the things I want to point out is that this is nothing new, that that diseases transit from animals to humans. Probably one of the most well-known diseases that we've acquired from animals is measles. Measles was originally a cattle disease, and as we domesticated cattle, we were exposed to all the diseases of the cattle, and one of them that we retained and then made it uniquely our own is measles, for example. So what do we know about this coronavirus outbreak? So we do know that sometime in November, most likely, there were some cases of pneumonia, specific pneumonia circulating in the area of Wuhan. By the end of December, the WHO was notified of this disease. There was not any talk at that time that it was a human-to-human transmitted disease. And pretty soon, beginning of January, there was a link to this wildlife trading market in Wuhan, the so-called seafood market. And that was closed quite quickly at the beginning of January, on the 2nd of January, I think. And then by the 13th of January, we actually already had a sequence, and we knew that it was a coronavirus, and within days also knew that this coronavirus was linked to wildlife. And of the first set of cases, the analysis of the first 88 cases that were known at the time, about 50%, just a little less than 50%, actually had links to the wildlife market. So what is it about these wildlife markets that's so special? The thing that's really important to understand in these wildlife markets in Southeast Asia is that the animals that are being sold there are alive. So that means they are able to shed viruses for days. They're obviously not in best welfare holding conditions, so they're absolutely stressed. They excrete the excrements and secretions and urine. And then at these markets also, you have a huge diversity of wildlife species, 50 to 100 species in some of the large markets, all together stacked on top of each other and brought in close contact with domestic species, mostly poultry and pigs. And then, of course, add into the mix all the people that are customers or vendors there. So, and you're bringing together animals which do not occur in nature anywhere near each other. The famous pangolin, which has been brought in from Africa, potentially sitting on top of a snake from South America, and on the Southeast Asian civet, for example. So one of the things the market was closed down immediately, and all the animals in that market were unfortunately removed. And I use removed because we don't actually know what happened to them. I assume they slaughtered them. Anyway, they got rid of them. We don't know. They were not sampled. But one of the things that sort of got a bit forgotten in the last month as this progressed is that there were 500 environmental samples taken, 500 and a bit environmental samples were taken after the market had been cleared out. And there were 33 positive samples. And of those 33 positive samples, 31 of them came from the western part of the market, which was the part where the wildlife was housed. So there's a very strong signal just from the environmental samples that the wildlife trade was involved in some form or other. What do we know? We do know that the ancestral or evolutionary host of this virus comes from a horseshoe bat species. It's a widely distributed group of bats throughout Southeast Asia and China. And the alignment on the entire genome, and this is important, the entire genome of that virus is 96%. So that's already quite close. and but that virus did not have the properties to enter a human cell. So that's important. I just want to take one step back and just say we've been, WCS together with our partners with support from USAID and others, have been looking at these viruses and pathogens at market interfaces the past 10 years, slightly more actually, probably more than 15 years. And what that has shown is that wildlife just invariably naturally carries and harbors a high number of viruses. Just in the bats alone in Southeast Asian context, there's some 500 coronaviruses which have been described in the past. And these vary, of course. Some of them are very distinct and far away from the present SARS cluster, but others are much more closely. And just to put it into context, there's about 1.7 million unknown viruses in mammals and birds. And of those, about 700,000 are thought to have the potential to create a zoonotic disease and infect humans. So that's a lot of a lot of viruses out there. And basically one assumes that for every known coronavirus, there are thousands of unknown ones. Just to put it in context, as you've probably all heard these discussions about creating a vaccine, and that's going to be a vaccine that's going to end all, basically. So what are the things we don't know? So what we don't know is, if you look here, we do know in MERS, another MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, we do know that the host is most likely a bat. It's actually an insectivorous bat. It uses a dromedary, a domesticated camel species, to transmit the virus into humans. And during the SARS-1 outbreak in 2002 and 2003, the ancestral or evolutionary host was again a bat. It used the civets and the raccoon dogs at a market interface to infect humans. And here we know that we have a bat, but what we don't know is what is the intermediary host, and if there even was an intermediary host. I have to be quite clear about that. And there's been a lot of media attention about this. You've read about this all the time. You know, it starts out with the bat soup, and then there was snakes, and then it came from space and whatnot. And then, of course, the pangolins got a lot of media attention in these last few weeks. And it's just very important to remember that the virus found in the pangolins is very distinct, actually, from the one that's circulating right now. But the receptor binding capacity of the viruses that they found in pangolin is quite similar, or very similar, to the one that's out there right now. However, it's not a simple case of reassortment. So the pangolin at the moment is off the hook, and we just don't know. And it's important just to say we don't know, and people are working on that, of course. So to put it really simple, this whole outbreak and pandemic is really not about soup, civets, or pangolins, or anything else you can come up with. It's all about interfaces. It's about the interfaces between wildlife and humans. And these interfaces, which are so important for these spillover events, are just increasing across the world. As we encroach the environment, as we disrupt the environment, the interfaces are increasing, and basically the disruption shakes loose the pathogens, if you want. It's a sort of a very simple image. The more you disturb, the more you disrupt the integrity also of the pathogen ecosystem there. One of the things we have found out about the markets, which is also very unique, and I'm happy to talk about why this interface is so unique, is that as you move a rat, in this case, we just take these rats, which are a mainstay of some of the wildlife that's being used in the market, and you move them through along the value chain from the field to the restaurant, the prevalence in coronaviruses just goes way up. So if you're going to eat a rat, it's better to prepare it out the field where you caught it, because you'll have 1 in 5 chance of having coronavirus. And then as it moves along the value chain, as it comes into contact with more and more wildlife species and other rats and so on, then the prevalence goes up. At the restaurant level, it's basically every second rat has a high percentage, is positive for coronavirus. So this amplification through the live trade at the markets is actually quite an important specific factor. in this interface. So while we say the interfaces in Southeast Asia are very special, we're calling them super interfaces because of the extraordinary magnitude, the size of these markets, and the number of species that are brought together there. It's important to realize there are many other interfaces as well. And if you look at the left-hand side here, you'll see a logging road going through a forest. And there's one way of looking at it, and that's a road that goes from A to B. The other way of looking at it, and if you're working with diseases and spillover events, you see this very, very long line of interface between the intact or more or less intact forest and the road. And that road nowadays obviously feeds into a city. And the cities have been growing. And this interface, basically it's been shown that along this road, you'll have about 500 meters to 1,000 meters you can walk into this forest. But it's quite difficult in the tropical forest to move a long distance. But 500 to 1,000 meters is being exploited, and there's trapping going on there. And while in the past all that trapping would have been for sustenance in the local community, now you'll walk to the road and you may just sell your wildlife, and it will move along the road and be in a large mega city within a few hours or within a day. And from there, of course, anywhere to any point in the world. One thing I want to point out, this is a graphic I've taken from a colleague in Bozeman, Montana, from Rainer Plowright. But it just sort of exemplifies how difficult it actually is for viruses to spill over. It's not something that is so super simple, and thankfully, because otherwise we would have a lot more pandemics. Basically, the virus has to first is mutating naturally, but has to acquire the possibilities to switch species or host species. For that, it needs to adapt its receptors. And then once it has that, and it, let's say, it manages to enter a human cell, it has to first, furthermore, be able to reproduce in the human cell. And then only very, very rarely will it actually be able to transmit from human to human, which is the case for this COVID-19 version of the coronavirus, which makes it such a huge issue because it's actually being transmitted by respiratory way from human to human. But just be aware, spillover events happen all the time. They normally have very little consequences for us. If you spend a lot of time in the woods in Canada and you hunt and you come in contact with wildlife, and we look at your blood and look at the antibodies you've seroconverted against a whole bunch of potential pathogens without ever realizing it. Veterinarians, for example, like myself, are known to have antibodies against all kinds of stuff because of the way we interact with wildlife and domestic livestock. So as I said, along these roads, you can move the wildlife that's been hunted and trapped, and it becomes, instead of becoming a community resource for indigenous peoples or local communities, it's suddenly something that's going to be traded in a larger city, and it's on its way to, and the largest cities in Africa nowadays, if you look at Kinshasa, it's a multi-billion inhabitants in these cities, so with international airport and so on. Now, from a perspective to Canada, if you look, I've just taken this example, and I come from Austria, and we hunt in the Alps, and this is a chamois that we use, and it makes great sausage and meat from that. And that's been going on for thousands of years, and similar obviously in Canada and in the boreal forests and in the Arctic. And one of the things that's important, if you look at the red spots along these maps, those are the areas of high biodiversity. That's where a lot of species live. And in the areas where a lot of species live is also where there's a lot of viruses. So the risk obviously is higher at 20 degrees north, 20 degrees south. But it is important to realize that it's not like there are no signals. There's not much going on in Canada, but if you look here in Scandinavia, and Europe, you will see some red spots. And that is the fact that you consume wildlife, there is a certain risk for some kind of spillover event to occur. Remember, there's a big difference between a spillover event that spills over into an individual or into a community and something that then develops into a pandemic. And the potential for something to develop into a pandemic is depends on many factors. One of them, of course, of your health system not picking it up early. But I just want to point out in our, we always like to tout our Alps as a pristine, wonderful environment and everything. And our chamois, of course, are fantastic, and so is our red deer and whatnot. But in the past 2 decades, we've seen an absolute maximum increase in tuberculosis in these alpine environments, which it's a health risk for humans, but it's even more a health risk for our livestock industry. Because there's an interface between wildlife and livestock as well. And it's changing, it's getting a lot warmer. We're losing a lot of we're losing the ice, of course, the glaciers. Wildlife is moving up, and so does cattle. And so this is that situation you have quite similar in the northern latitudes. The change is just a lot faster as it is in the mountains. It is the further north you go. So your pathogen will change as well. Now, one of the ways to adapt this, and I've taken it on purpose, taken an example from the WCS project, the health program runs in the Republic of Congo. We're obviously very, very supportive and work together with indigenous peoples and local communities to provide so that they have access to wildlife to meet their dietary needs, high quality dietary needs and protein needs. But one of the things we've done, because this is an Ebola endemic area, is that we've worked with them to have an early warning system. So there's a lot of community outreach. We have a sort of a network. It's pretty informal, but even in Africa now, in northern ROC, you work with a normal phone, and you get a text message from a hunter in some village who says, "Look, I just found a dead gorilla. Can you come and check it out?" So we'll deploy, the team will deploy to head out into the forest. As I said, sorry, this is sort of just a lot of outreach on what you should do with the wildlife. But back to the gorilla, the team will head out and then collect samples from that gorilla. Obviously, this is all in super hazmat kind of gear. And this paired with modern technology allows us to actually sample on site. So in this case, what you see there, which is looks like an old iPhone, is actually an old iPhone, drives a PCR machine, which is a handheld molecular diagnostic machine. And with that, we can determine within 45 minutes if that carcass is Ebola positive. And the other thing you see on the other hand is actually a sequencer, which we can now also use in the field to do full genome sequencing, basically, of viruses if we wanted to. And all this happens very, very quickly. In this case, when the carcasses are negative, both for anthrax and for Ebola, we do a full necropsy and then process the samples subsequently at a central lab. So you can see this community engagement as an early detection and to prevent spillover events, because we really mustn't neglect, we have this sort of idea, the dark heart of Africa, and it's a long way away. But honestly, from these communities, there's a Chinese road that goes up to the north of Congo now. You can walk down to the road, sell your monkey. 12 hours later, that's in Brazzaville. And be at a party, and next day someone gets sick, gets on the plane, flies to Paris, and you can work out the rest. It's just this interconnectedness which really drives a lot of things. So while it's important to know the difference between the risk between temperate areas and tropical areas, we have to be aware that there is no zero risk when you're consuming wildlife. There is no zero risk when you consume livestock, though it is decreased. One of the ways to address this is with a holistic health approach, and this is something WCS has been a champion for back in 2004, they developed these Manhattan Principles on One Health. And this year we, with the help of the German government, developed, basically upgraded them after 15 years to more tightly integrate the environment, climate change, and similar things. Basically, just to give it a simple thing, is what we need is a really holistic approach to health, which integrates animal health, wildlife health, ecosystem health, human health, but also the drivers, climate change, socioeconomic, sociocultural drivers. We need to integrate all of those if we want to avert future epidemics and obviously pandemics as well. And a lot of this is obviously context-specific. Things we do in the Republic of Congo are not applicable in detail, of course, to areas in the northern boreal forests. That's, I think, quite obvious. I put this slide here because it's one of the things that sort of gets a bit undervalued at the moment. While we're talking a lot about banning the trade of wildlife for consumption, of the commercial trade for consumption, especially in these urban areas in Southeast Asia with these crazy markets. One thing one also has to clearly put in context, wild meat from a healthy population and with a respective adapted immune system. So if you've hunted them all your life, you do have an immune system that's also adapted. It's certainly in most cases a lot healthier than the alternative. And definitely the food types on the right kill an inordinate amount of people every year, which is orders of magnitude more than any virus goes out and kills. It's just much more, it's much more hidden, of course. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about impacts and risk and so on. And then finally, just a word on WCS's policy and messaging at the moment. Some have been put out a bit by the very blunt messaging originally. I think, you know, in the media landscape we live in now, the initial messaging has to be blunt. We were addressing Southeast Asian markets of an incredible scale, but I really invite each and every one of you to visit the much more nuanced policy in the background. So it's basically permanently ban the commercial trade in wildlife for consumption. We're working a lot with, as pointed out, we're one of the largest counter wildlife trafficking organizations in the world. So we're working to reinforce that, and especially as we see there's going to be a slight pivot into illegal trade. And then obviously working on changing the consumption behavior, especially in the cities. And honestly, it's interesting how civil society in China and throughout Southeast Asia have reacted and reject the use of wildlife as a food source at the moment. There was actually a BBC story today about how companies are scaling up the use of alternative meats in China, which is something which was unbelievable 4 months ago. And then basically, obviously, we're also mainstreaming these One Health approaches to address health concerns. So thanks very much. And, you know, I'm really happy to discuss this, take questions and discuss this with you and Justina.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was terrific. And just before I open up the floor for questions, I just wanted to re-emphasize a couple of messages that Chris put at the end, which related to sort of how WCS kind of first really focused on the wildlife trade aspect itself to banning the markets for consumption, and had very blunt messages in that respect. No other countries around China will act until China shifts its laws, and that might be something, Chris, that you can give a live report on, because it does seem to be shifting in that direction. But the nuanced messaging is also really important. One of you has already asked in the chat room about what are the risks in North America, which Chris went into shortly after the question was asked. And the chances are of being the source of a pandemic, of having the constellation of factors, are low at this moment. But still, the messaging about the interface is still very important. We have several diseases in North America that have started in this way, through pathogen spillover, not causing mass mortality or pandemic by any stretch, but certainly affecting our health overall, and wildlife health in general. Some of the messaging that we're working on, we've got a paper that's coming out, or a document that's coming out very shortly, on the relationship between ecological integrity, so how the natural systems are faring, and emerging infectious diseases, and looking at the science behind that, and what clear messages happen about the relative risk across the world in different geographies, but and at the same time what that says about that interface question that Chris was talking about previously. But we're also working on an actual really pointy-headed piece about the exact the host of pathogens and so on that are in Arctic and boreal environments in particular, to try and frame that in a way that people can understand about what is out there, what are the relative risks, what are the factors that relate to it, and mostly in the context of hunting and consumption of wildlife. And so that will take a little while to come out, because it's and we're working with experts on this. We have expertise in our own house led by Chris, and that'll be something to look forward to. But we hope in general that we can provide more information on that, and particular tailored to the context of Canadian conservation. So I think I'll open it up for questions. And one question that has come up is what's the value of the wildlife trade in Asia, and whether China has reopened, and also can you talk a little bit about the legal framework right now for China, which and what's being worked on there, and the likelihood of a ban. You're muted, I think. Shoot. No, you're not muted, but I can't hear you anymore. Somehow you're not, we can't hear you anymore, Chris. And we're not muting you. Okay. Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Okay, go ahead.
My gosh, the technology got the better of me there. This process with banning, and so it's been very impressive actually to be part of this. So basically, at the beginning of January, it was clear that this market in China was at least associated with the outbreak, and within days, the Chinese administration banned absolutely in the entire country all trade of wildlife for any reason whatsoever. And not only did they ban it, they actually enforced it, because the first thing you say, well, all right, it has a ban. But because we have an office in China and have lots of a good network of NGOs that we work with, we immediately were able to assure ourselves that this ban was being implemented. So within days, there was practically no wildlife to be found anymore on markets and restaurants, on e-platforms, and so on. And then at the beginning of February, the president of China and a mixture of ministries and administrations issued a statement that they were going to move from this temporary ban on all wildlife to a permanent ban on all wildlife related to consumption. And since that day, basically under the leadership of our team in China, the health program has also been helping, review and then advise on new legislation. And there are 3 pieces of legislation which are being worked on at the moment. That's the animal epidemic law. And I'm using these words because these are the machine translated words. Sounds a bit corny. Animal epidemic law, the wildlife law, and the animal, I think it's the livestock law, I think is the correct term. All 3 of these pieces of legislation are being reworked. And it's been an interesting process. I've had to sort of go back to school because I haven't done any veterinary public health in the sense of, farm to fork process. But I've been looking at this, article after article. And what you can see there is very clearly that the legislation could in no way ever pick up any kind of disease outbreak. It's just the way the structure, the way it is structured, and the kind of control measures that were in place. So that's moving really fast. We're very optimistic that this will be enshrined, this permanent ban will be enshrined in legislation in China within the next 2 months, when the People's Committee, no, it's the Central People's Committee, the analog of the parliament, can sit again after the coronavirus outbreak, and we think that's going to happen in the next 2 months. The good thing is there was an immediate follow-on from Vietnam at the beginning of March. The Prime Minister of Vietnam announced that similarly to China, Vietnam would also ban the consumption of wildlife across, irrespective if it's legal, sustainable, illegal, everything will be banned. And both China and Vietnam can definitely enforce this, so we're pretty sure that's going to come very, very quickly. That's going to be a major change on a global scale. And then we hope there's a follow-on, and there's indications that Cambodia, Laos, PR will follow suit. I think one that's we're unsure at the moment is Indonesia. Has very, very large markets. They're always a bit more independent, I would say. And so we're waiting to see what happens there and support the administrations. I think, is that good? I think.
Yeah, that's great. And in fact, you answered another question that followed it with that last bit about what the other countries are doing.
Yeah.
You hinted at it a bit when you spoke about the One Health framework, back in 2004, and the one that you just reinvigorated in October of 2019 with the Berlin Principles. But there's a question about whether you could say more about habitat conservation in general and its links to enhancing or preventing pathogen spillover.
Yeah, so as I was pointing out, it's all about it's mostly primarily about this interface. And as the interface increases between wildlife and humans, there's just more opportunity for spillover events to occur if we, concentrating now on infectious diseases. And it's mostly on these frontiers of destruction. It's exactly where the forest is being, if we look at forest, where the forest is being disturbed and logged and encroached on. Those are the areas where you see the strongest signal of spillover events. One of the classic examples in disease transmission is when you start deforesting. If you clear it all and put asphalt down, that's good. There's no more pathogens, you're all good. But obviously you lose of all the other services, related to climate change and CO2 and everything. So obviously that's not an option. And who wants to live in a world with asphalt? But at these edges, this is where people will walk and interact with the forest on an increased scale. So this is where the pathogens will be transported out. And I think the one way to look at it is when you take a dead animal, you shoot something, or you take it alive and you transport it, you also take with it all the pathogens it carries. It's like a suitcase, and that suitcase is full of pathogens that have a potential. They constitute a hazard. And if you give them enough opportunity, and you do this often enough, you will actually be able to get a spillover event. That's why the markets in Southeast Asia are so special, just through the thousands and thousands of animals that are there. It's a numbers game, basically. It's when you play a slot machine. At least is how I assume a slot machine works. I've actually never done this, but you keep throwing pennies in or whatever, and then at some time, probably it takes a long time, but then you suddenly get whatever it is that aligns, and you'll get a winner. And that's when the virus wins and manages to slip through all the barriers, basically. The other one that you see a lot is changes in, and I think this is something you need to be aware of also in Canada, of course, and I'm sure your public health authorities are already monitoring and modeling this, but as the temperatures rise, you're going to start seeing vector diseases expanding along the East Coast at least. And I think you see quite a nice signal there already. And that's basically related to, mosquitoes moving northwards. And when you start deforesting, you actually select for certain mosquito species. And unfortunately, it's basically always those that transmit infectious disease. So the classic examples, deforesting, partial deforesting, really racks up the prevalence of malaria in Borneo, for example, increase in Zika throughout Mesoamerica where deforestation happens. So those are things you do need to be aware of.
Yeah, and a question that came to mind when you were talking about that relates also to the a question that somebody has asked. The tigers in the zoo. There's been now, and there was news this morning that there were a number of other large cats. So there are 8 in total that have tested positive in the Bronx Zoo, and has had quite a bit of attention. And one of the interesting things about that was that they actually showed symptoms themselves. And how with these viruses in the markets, are they, are there incidents where they're showing symptoms of this, or is this more about the novel disease that emerges afterwards that has those unique properties?
And so in most cases, the host reservoir, the reservoir host does not exhibit any kind of symptoms at all. That can vary. Of course, there are diseases where ultimately in the long term, they may exhibit disease, but normally these are just potential pathogens normally. They're viruses which are not causing any harm in one species. And as they mutate and switch species, they can induce disease. So just to link to the tiger, so it doesn't get more value than it should. So yeah. All these tigers are doing well, first of all, and the lions, everyone's doing well. They had very mild disease, and they're on the way to a full recovery, or have fully recovered. And I just always want to point, I've been asked this a lot, even though it's not my specialty, and it's mostly my colleague, Dr. Callie, who takes care of these animals. But I always like to tell the story. My father sent me a text message that, my father seems to feel that he needs to inform me on COVID on a regular basis several times a day. But he did send me a text message and said, and I think he got it really well. He said, "Oh, I thought social distancing with tigers was the norm." And that's the point. If you stay away 6 feet from a tiger, you're not going to infect the tiger. So, and we see that with domestic cats. Yes, a handful of domestic cats have seroconverted and have tested positive on PCR for COVID, but they're housed together with someone who's shedding the virus day in, day out over a long period of time. So it needs to be put in context there. And I can see there's a question of, and I'm just going to answer this because while I'm on my little tiger story here, the experimentally infected cats, and experimentally infected, just to put it in context, means someone takes a syringe with a lot of virus and shoots it up your nose, basically. A lot more virus than you'd probably be able to pick up in a long night in a bar with 15 other people that are already positive. In this experimental setting, cats were actually able to transmit the virus from one cat to another, but also in the domestic cats, none of the cats really exhibited strong symptoms. So the virus can get into cat cells, but obviously cannot induce, at this point in time, any kind of significant disease.
Yeah, so are there any other questions? We've run out of chat questions, and if you're welcome to raise your hand using the signals below under more, or actually, where are the raising hands are somewhere, but or just unmute yourself and ask, or signal to me in the chat room in some fashion. I'm watching very carefully. But I do really appreciate your perspective on the Canadian situation. That was, or North America in particular. and the fact that you need this constellation of factors generally that with so much biodiversity, moving the animals around, putting them on top of each other, eating of a wide diversity of animals, and all of those constellation of factors together before sparking something of this magnitude. Here's a question. Obviously, there's not a significant legal trade in wildlife in Canada, but there are policy changes. But are there policy changes that Canada should be considering for wildlife management and animal agriculture? And you obviously don't know the policy framework all that well, but are you aware of things that are being considered either in North America or Europe that are acting ahead for something that of this nature?
Well, you know, one of the things I brought up is tuberculosis. That's and you've had you know, back in the day, I'm sure you still have issues with tuberculosis, but I think famously Saskatoon was you know, one of the core areas, I think, where you had these outbreaks of tuberculosis in your cattle herds, but the origin was in farmed wildlife in deer. So this is something we're seeing throughout Europe. This has become a really, really big issue. The reservoir of tuberculosis in wildlife, and it's multiple species. It's in red deer, but more worrisome for us in Europe is that it's in wild boar. And with climate change and the warming, the wild boar population has exploded. And I know, Justina, you know it quite well up in Berlin, in that area, but it's unbelievable. So wild boar has reached a level throughout many parts of Europe where normal hunting is never going to be able to control it. Austria has a 24/7, you can shoot day and night. They've even allowed scopes now to shoot at nighttime. It's hard to get a wild boar, and especially because there's a lot of culture behind it. So hunters are not targeting the most efficient population reduction shots. They have some. Anyway, so this has become a huge problem. Wild boar, red deer, badgers harbor the bacteria, and that is really seriously impacting the economies of multiple countries. So that's a problem, and has been a problem throughout Canada and North America, in the US, and that. Working with that, of course, requires a lot of investment and infrastructure to deal with it. Then you have the CWD in deer.
Chronic wasting disease.
Chronic wasting disease, which obviously also is an issue. And you can see how fast the situation changes by Norway acquiring chronic wasting disease. Very surprisingly for most of us. 2 years ago, basically, in their reindeer herds and some individual cases in moose as well. So any kind of movement of wildlife has to be well reflected on, and also the farming of wildlife. Intensive use of landscapes to farm wildlife needs to be carefully reflected on. I personally have huge problems when they start feeding wildlife, feeding sites. I've been fighting a 15-year war against hunting association feeding wildlife in the high Alps. You know, you get the agglomerations in the winter. Animals move about 1,000 meters during the winter, and Mycobacterium, the bacterium that causes TB, can persist on feeding troughs for weeks on end during the cold months. So these are the kind of things you need to reflect on. And this movement, the unregulated movement of wildlife, I don't know how well it's regulated in Canada, but at least in Austria, we got quite a nice bunch of people who are moving these things around at night, right, left, and center. I don't know if that happens in Canada, but you know, it's quickly loaded on a trailer and it's 1,000 kilometers further, sold the next day. So those kind of things there's a lot of concern about that. Not so much for human health, not directly, and certainly not on an epidemic scale.
And just a few notes to follow up on Canada specifically related to those points. I'm not so sure about wildlife movement. I can think of a few examples where that could be tightened up a bit more, but also one area that will probably need a bit more attention is kind of baiting. Baiting for hunters. There's you do that to attract bears, and you do that to attract deer. It's so that they can come to you, and you don't always have to find them. That's a fairly significant practice here all around. We also have wild boars are moving and spreading here significantly in Canada as well. One of the epicenters in Saskatchewan that you hear quite a bit about. And chronic wasting disease has had a high profile recently. It's significant in Montana. There's no record of transmission from to humans, but there is concern about it coming from the deer farms into hunted animals, and the question marks about that. And that's in BC in particular, in British Columbia. There's been a lot of action on that from the government side to try and surveil for this disease and find it, but and prevent it coming, or find it immediately when it arrives. And that is not yet happened here, but very nervous about it being right across the border. We have just a few more minutes. Can you just talk a little bit more about climate change and how it might be expected to and the mechanism for why it would be expected to increase these occurrences?
Right. So obviously, when you look at something in a One Health lens, then climate change is like the big driver over the top of everything, because it's changing landscapes. It's changing pathogen distribution ranges, and this is particularly known up. Just an example out of Canada, the northern, the communities that eat seals, for example, that hunt and eat seals. The change in the ice coverage is really changing the distribution of seals and where the seals are coming from and the pathogens they bring with it. So you always have to imagine the climate change changes the hunted species, it changes the vectors, and basically also changes the pathogens that they have access to. And if you're getting seals coming from further away now, you're also bringing new pathogens in, and the communities that have been hunting them for eons may not have the antibodies necessary to deal with that. So, we always talk about these landscapes of pathogens, but the other one that sort of pairs together with it are the landscape of the immune response. So if I go and eat a seal today, somewhere in northern Canada, it's probably not going to be great. I'm probably not going to do great the next day because I'm just not adaptive, basically from my microbiome, but also from my immune response. And so you can imagine that if the pathogens change, that you could start seeing spillover events into communities, which you need to pick up quite quickly. And so that's why I was also highlighting this importance of community-based epidemiology, community-based early detection systems and knowledge, so that you can if what are we, 27 of us sit down tomorrow and celebrate and eat, let's say we go out and hunt a moose and then we eat it, and half of us have fever the next day. Well, it'd be really good if we would pick up on that and say, hey, how are you feeling today? Not so. And then we don't all just, ignore that and maybe get on an airplane and fly to Toronto or wherever. I think we need to start thinking about these things more dynamically, and we need to put in place the knowledge and the understanding of what the consequences are. And so climate change everywhere, and as I said, for the vector-borne diseases, that's massive. The change in tick ecology, mosquito and vectors, that's really huge. And you're seeing some outbreaks of diseases in Canada in wildlife, which are quite baffling actually, and I'm sure there's a climate signal there.
So you mean up in the Arctic systems, like the muskoxen and die-offs? Yeah.
That's a really a very from a pathologist sort of point of view, really super interesting, but it's also baffling how that's happening in the spread of the Erysipelotrix that's quite interesting. And I'm sure there's a strong climate signal there.
Yeah, and these musk oxen have died in significant numbers, like whole groups have just dropped dead and been found, these carcasses, and that's been happening in earnest for about 6 years or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up if that's okay with you, Peter. Do we have any other questions from everybody? So thankful for everybody's interest. And we will have a recording available and more materials that'll be coming. And I want to thank Peter in particular for sparking this idea and entrusting us to deliver. For Chris for taking his time. He's in enormous demand these days with doing things like this and testifying to Congress and whatnot, and at the front lines. So we really look forward to more from that. And thank you so much, Chris. We're more than happy to follow up with any of you on specific questions, and for you know, any way that you might want to know more about how we're working on this and how you might want to help. Very open to more dialogue on that question. And thank you so much. And I think with that we'll adjourn for the day, and take care, everybody, and please stay well.
Bye-bye. Stay safe, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Justina.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. That
Yes.
was awesome.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's Chris.
I really appreciated that. That was just great. All right.
Okay, we'll talk to you later.
Be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you so
Justina
much.
and Peter.
That was
Okay.
That's great.
Okay,
Thanks,
so
Peter.
I've got to stop recording, but I'm terrified to do it because I don't know what's going to happen.
Thanks.
It's all going to blow up.
You're good. You're good. You can do that.